Over the years, independent record labels have made themselves a crucial part of punk music and culture. In fact, one could even argue that punk did worlds for defining what it meant to be a DIY independent label, as well as their place and significance in the music world. In past decades, it wasn't uncommon for a label to be associated with a specific sound or breed of punk music as well, with many of them becoming nearly as important as the bands they helped rise to prominence in the eyes of many fans. Although in the current age of music, the demand and significance of record labels has declined overall, many of these labels not only live on through their legacy, but also can still play a huge role in terms of promotion. And on that note, there's a select few that have managed to stay remarkably relevant regardless of the changes to the music world, one of which I would argue has done so better than any other label in punk history. Hello folks, my name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and my friends, I am thrilled to be starting the new year off with a video on the one and only Fat Records. As always, I'll be taking you guys through the history of Fat Wreck, starting off with its humble beginnings in the early 90s, all the way to its legendary position in punk rock today, along with some extra trivia, of course, and some of my personal thoughts on the label and the impact it's had on my experience with punk rock. Before we dive in, I want to let you all know that I did my very best to put together a Fat Wreck overview Spotify playlist of all the killer bands they've had over the years, so if you're interested, you can find a link to that in the description below. I also want to give a shout out to all my wonderful Patreon supporters, D. Razzle, Martin Smith, Lovely Lizzie, The Real Ghost Freak, Project ZS, and Robert Daniel Pickard. Thank you all so much for the support. I've got a live review and commentary series going on there where I talk about classic punk records, and I've done a couple videos so far on Black Flag and Bad Religion, but this month I'll be talking about NOFX's Punk and Drublic, so if that sounds interesting to you, you can find a link to my Patreon in the description below. And finally, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways! As many of us probably know, the story of Fat Wreck begun at the hands of NOFX lead vocalist and bass player Michael Burkett, or more widely known by his stage name Fat Mike. Mike had become frustrated from many failed attempts at getting NOFX onto a label after their departure from the infamous Mystic Records, so he would take matters into his own hands and started his own label called Colossal Wassail Records in 1987. Founded with the only intention of putting out music from NOFX, this label would drop a mere 3 releases total, 2 EPs and 1 full-length. The most notable release here is the original pressing of NOFX's debut album Liberal Animation from 1988, but the label would also issue the original run of the PMRC Can Suck on This 7-inch and NOFX's split with the German band Drowning Roses. During this time, Mike and the rest of NOFX would also work side by side with Epitaph Records owner and Bad Religion guitarist Brett Gurwitz, recording Liberal Animation at his studio West Beach Recorders in Hollywood. Although Brett had offered to release the album through Epitaph, the band opted to release it themselves instead, eager to see what they could do with a label of their own. NOFX would of course eventually make the hop to Epitaph in 1989 though for the release of their sophomore album S&M Airlines. But Mike was certainly not about to give up on his own label, and during NOFX's Epitaph years he would work alongside Brett and Jay Bentley, gathering as much information as he could on the DIY record business. But that's just a little bit of background info. When did things really get started for Fat Wreck? After roughly a year with Epitaph, Fat Mike felt he had enough know-how to take another stab at starting a label, and he would officially found Fat Records with his now ex-wife Erin Burkett in late 1989. The couple worked out of their apartment in San Francisco with little to no plans of it expanding into anything more than a hobby, simply wanting to put out records from bands they both liked. Fat Wreck's first release would then take place in January of 1990 with a reissue of NOFX's The PMRC Can Suck on This 7-inch, naturally giving NOFX the title of the first band to ever sign with the label. Fat wouldn't get its first brand new release until 2 years later in May 1992, with NOFX's now heavily renowned 7-inch The Longest Line. With punk on the rise as the 90s got further and further underway, Mike found his endeavors with NOFX not only introducing him to countless great bands, but also generating income he could further invest into his label. And it wasn't long after that until he started approaching bands to sign. The first of these bands was a 5-piece ensemble from Goleta, California called Section 8. After receiving a demo tape from the band's lead vocalist Joey Cape, Mike signed the band on the condition that they change their band name. Section 8 would then rebrand themselves as Lagwagon, and their album Duh would then become Fat Wreck's first full-length release in October of 1992. Lagwagon's entrance to the roster would also begin a business practice that many would consider unorthodox or even risky, formulating what you could call handshake record deals based simply upon trust between friends and associates. While I can't say for certain how in practice this still is, or that it would be a wise thing to do anywhere outside of punk rock, I would speculate that this solidified Fat Wreck's organic nature in the punk scene, and likely gained them a good reputation pretty quickly. And it wouldn't be much longer after that until the label added their second band, San Jose, California's No Use for a Name. I've done an entire video about No Use, so if you want to hear more about them, you can find a link in the description below. But long story short, after hearing their debut album Incognito and playing with them in their hometown of San Jose, Mike leapt at the opportunity to add another phenomenal band to Fat Wreck's roster. NOFX's tours throughout North America had also brought them to the great northern province of Manitoba, Canada, and Fat Records would sign its first international band after Winnipeg's Propagandhi opened for NOFX in their hometown. Although many of his friends were telling him to put out a record from the band Ill Repute instead, Mike saw something in Propagandhi that others in his circle didn't at the time, and their debut album How to Clean Everything would make its first appearance on the same day as No Use for a Name's The Daily Grind in May of 1993. 1993 would also see Fat Wreck sign itself 2 more bands in California, Santa Cruz's Good Riddance and Simi Valley's Strung Out. Good Riddance would get signed first after they sent Mike a demo of their newest material at the time, and he of course also knew them from playing shows in Santa Cruz. And once he'd heard the new songs, he decided to put out a 7-inch and a full-length from them. And as I'm sure a lot of us probably know, Fat Wreck has been putting out Good Riddance's records ever since. Strung Out would join the roster shortly after, and although they'd previously sent in a demo tape, Mike was unsure if he wanted to sign them because of how metal influenced their sound was. NOFX had of course played with Strung Out several times though, so the bands were reasonably well acquainted and had gone through a series of conversations regarding Strung Out signing with Fat. They would officially close the deal after vocalist Jason Cruz and former bassist Jim Cherry carpeted Fat Mike's apartment, however, with Mike agreeing to sign them as payment. So within its first couple of years, Fat Wreck was already putting itself in the position to become one of the definitive labels of the 90s punk scene. They already had a really strong group of bands attached, and would also put out a handful of 7-inch releases from other noteworthy names like Rancid and 88 Fingers Louie. But it wasn't really until the mid-90s that we saw things actually start to pick up. Before we get to that, however, I think it's really important to mention the producer Ryan Greene and his studio Motor Studios in San Francisco. He's a pretty big-name producer these days, having worked with everyone from Megadeth to Jay-Z to Alice Cooper, but he actually had a huge role in the Fat Wreck sound back in the early days, and has production credits on the better half of the label's classic catalog. He's also the one responsible for that famous clicky kick drum sound that I'm sure all of us musicians here are aware of as a staple of most punk rock these days. Typically, he would use these metal pads you could get at Guitar Center to cover up the kick drum, but when No Use for a Name were recording Leche Con Carne, he actually managed to get the same sound out of a silver dollar coin and some duct tape. Personally, I think with out-of-the-box thinking like that, it's no wonder he went on to be a record producer of his status. Not to mention, he did an amazing job with so many of these records, and his work from this era has aged remarkably well. So well that it's not uncommon to hear bands still trying to replicate his signature sound these days. During the mid-90s, we'd also see Fat Wreck start to become a major player in the world of what I guess you might call old school or punk pop-punk. The most noteworthy of these bands is probably Victorville, California's Face to Face. They hopped on sometime in the early 90s and would put out their single Disconnected during the summer of 1993. But like I said, they certainly weren't the only band of this variety to be signed to Fat during this era. And the Northern California-based Bracket would join the roster shortly after, dropping their first 2 7-inch releases on Fat in August of 1994. And this would of course open up the door for a whole bunch of new bands to join into the Fat Wreck camp, with Tilt, Goober Patrol, Diesel Boy, and Horace Pinker being a few noteworthy mentions, as well as one of my favorites from this era, Hendon England's Snuff. Fat would also spawn the Subsidy Honest Dons records, putting out releases from a ton of bands like this, including Chicks Dig It, The Muffs, The Riverdales, Limp, and another one of my all-time faves, Teen Idols. Honest Dons would also house some early releases from a few third-wave ska bands like the Dancehall Crashers and the Mad Caddies. And as I'm sure some of you guys probably know, the Mad Caddies would actually end up joining the proper Fat Wreck roster a little later on. The mid-90s would also give us the first appearance of Fat Wreck's beloved compilation series, beginning in October of 1994 with Fat Music for Fat People, featuring various tracks picked from full-length and 7-inch releases pressed in 93 and 94. This series would receive 6 entries during its original run between 1994 and 2002, however it would eventually resume in 2010 and has sporadically been dropping releases since then. And of course, we can't talk about Fat Wreck in the mid-90s without discussing just how big a deal it was to be on the label back then. With skate punk blowing up all over the world, all of their big-ticket bands were bringing in tons of record sales, and apparently they were even able to give everyone signed Christmas bonuses. The punk boom during the mid to late 90s would give Mike a chance to branch out a little more with who he was signing. A few international skate punk bands, including High Standard from Japan and Wizo from Germany, would join the roster, but most of the US-based bands tended to differ a little from the standard Fat Wreck sound we'd known up until this point. Santa Cruz, California's more street punk influenced Swingin' Utters would be the first of these bands to hop onto Fat, putting out their debut on the label A Juvenile Product of the Working Class in September 1996. Just on a side note, if any of you guys would want to see a video about Swingin' Utters, leave a comment below. They're one of my all-time favorite bands, and I feel like they haven't ever gotten enough recognition in the scene. But anyways, the Utters would be the first of several newcomers to pull the label away from its roots in skate punk, and another big name to do so would be New York City's hardcore godfathers Sick of It All, and their 1999 LP Call to Arms. Richmond, Virginia's Avail would also join the roster in 99, dropping the EP 100 times in the fall of that year, and later their full-length One Wrench in June of 2000. And finally, this segment would not be complete without a mention of Prospect Heights, Illinois' Screeching Weasel and their 1996 full-length Bark Like a Dog and 98 follow-up Television City Dream. However, Weasel would end up leaving Fat in 1999 in favor of releasing through their own label, Panic Button Records. The late 90s and early 2000s are when we really started to see Fat Wreck shift directions in terms of the kinds of bands they were signing, and they began to lean a lot more towards a gruffer mid-tempo sound than the hyper-fast skate punk stuff they'd been so well known for up until this point. So obviously the most well-known band to come out of the 2000s Fat Wreck scene is Chicago, Illinois' Rise Against, putting out their debut record The Unraveling through the label in April 2001, and later their sophomore Revolutions Per Minute in 2003. But they are certainly not the only band to rise up on Fat during this era. Also hailing from Chicago, the Lawrence Arms would join the Fat roster in the early 2000s too, after putting out their first 2 full-lengths with the adjacent label Asian Man Records. They would drop their 3rd full-length release, Apathy and Exhaustion, in February of 2002, and would remain on Fat until the early 2010s when they hopped over to Epitaph for their 6th release, Metropole. 2002 would also give us the Fat Wreck debut of Minnesota's Dillinger 4, and although they'd been going pretty strong already with their previous 2 releases they did on Hopeless Records, they would pump out 2 more with Fat. First would come Situationist Comedy in 2002, and then later Civil War in 2008. As far as I know, D4 is still signed to Fat, but as of this upload, Civil War is still their most recent studio release to date. They would issue a live album in 2020, however, but like I said, no new material since 08. Fat would also take on a number of other bands playing this similar style of gruff pop punk like None More Black, The Loved Ones, Smoker Fire, and Dead to Me, but I'd say the biggest band of this variety to join the Fat Wreck camp during the 2000s is Gainesville, Florida's Against Me. They would drop their first release with Fat in the fall of 2003 under the name Against Me as the Eternal Cowboy, and this would mark the 2nd full-length release in their catalog. And just because I know somebody's gonna leave a comment about this, yes, Against Me did start out out as a folk punk band, but even at this point, they had already moved on to a much more standard punk sound. And although there are definitely more elements of their folkier stuff on this release than most of their others after it, there's virtually nothing left of it in their sound these days. The label would also put out a number of releases from older bands during the 2000s, one of the most notable examples, of course, being The Descendants. They would make their Fat Wreck debut in 2004 with their 6th album, Cool to Be You, which was something Fat Mike was particularly proud of at the time. Fat Wreck would also do a couple of releases from Alberta, Canada's Chicks Dig It, as well as British Columbia's The Real Mackenzies, and the Los Angeles-based Dickies for their final album to date, All This Puppet Stew. The 90s pop-punk poster boys Screeching Weasel would also return to Fat Wreck during this era, with the release of their Best Of comp from 2005, Weasel Mania. However, they would later be dropped from Fat in 2011 over a beef between vocalist Ben Weasel and Fat Mike. I guess it originally started over Screeching Weasel supposedly making fun of Mike in a song, but I have a feeling it's a lot more personal than that since those guys have been taking a lot of pot shots at each other over the years. The 2000s would also see Fat Wreck start their still ongoing live album series Live in a Dive, beginning with No Use for a Names in 2001, and as of this upload, the most recent release in this series is actually an old live recording from the band Rich Kids on LSD, originally done in 1989 but unreleased until June of 2022. Fat Wreck would release a series of singles called The Fat Club during the 2000s as well, which featured mostly bands already on the roster, but a handful of non-fat names like the Vandals and Enemy U too. And finally, the label would then close off the decade with a 20-year overview compilation titled Retrospective in December of 2009. The 2000s were also when Fat Mike would launch that punk voter campaign, which if you don't know was basically just his attempt at getting people into musical genres like punk, emo, and metal to vote. If you're familiar with those Rock Against Bush comps that also came out around this time, those were tied in with this whole thing. The punk voter campaign would also start a slight beef between Fat Mike and Propagandhi after they criticized him in the campaign with their song Rock for Sustainable Capitalism off their 4th album Potemkin City Limits. Although there was a little dispute between them at the time, Mike would still end up releasing their album through Fat at the end of the day, and these days I doubt there's anything left of this falling out between the two of them. But moving on, the 2010s would continue the trend of Fat Wreck's association with the gruff pop-punk sound, with the likes of Masked Intruder, Get Dead, Cobra Skulls, and the Nightbirds joining their roster. And although all of those bands may not perfectly fit that descriptor, I'd say they were all definitely closely tied to that scene in one way or another. Fat Wreck would also take on the punk bluegrass fusion band Old Man Markley during this era, who coincidentally played with NOFX the first time I saw them. Fat would also keep up their practice of signing international bands during this decade, and most notably when they signed Haifa Israel's Useless ID. This was also around the time that the label became heavily associated with Gainesville, Florida's annual fest, and they released the compilation Fat Music for Fest People on October 28th, 2011, which would have been the first day of the festival that year. The 2010s are also, of course, when the Bomb Pops joined the Fat Wreck roster, putting out their debut full-length Fear of Missing Out in 2017, and they were actually on a label called Red Scare Industries before getting signed, which happens to be owned by a former Fat Wreck employee named Toby Jag. Several other bands like the Lillingtons, Cobra Skulls, and the Copyrights would also put out releases with Red Scare before jumping over to Fat later on. Bad Cop, Direct Hit, Pears, and The Last Gang would also all be signed to Fat during the mid to late 2010s, but I would say the most well-known band to join the roster during the latter half of this decade, besides the Bomb Pops, is probably Houston, Texas's Days and Days. They actually wouldn't put out their first release through Fat Wreck until May of 2020, but I remember hearing about them hopping on a little bit before that, and with all the buzz they were getting back then, I'm really not surprised they did. Fat Wreck would also, of course, continue to drop releases from veteran bands during the 2010s, with classics like Strung Out, NOFX, Good Riddance, and Swingin' Utters all still popping out new music every now and again. They would also welcome a few new veteran bands to their roster as well. New York City's Morning Glory would hop onto Fat in the early 10s with the release of their albums Poets Were My Heroes and War Psalms in 2012 and 14. And the 90s ska punk favorites The Suicide Machines would also jump onto the label towards the end of the decade, putting out their 7th album Revolution Spring in March of 2020. Gainesville, Florida's Less Than Jake would also have a brief stint on Fat with a couple of releases in 2012 and 13, and they had actually worked with the label before tour in the year 2000 for their fourth full-length Borders and Boundaries, so I won't be surprised if we see them team up with Fat Wreck again sometime soon. I do, of course, also have to mention the controversial band Leftover Crack and their vocalist Scott Sturgeon's side project Starfucking Hipsters. I'm sure most of my regular viewers watching here know I'm not a huge fan of him and don't endorse his bands due to his history of being an abuser and making no effort to correct his behavior. But I do know that I'll get some comments if I don't mention those bands, so yes, they were on Fat Wreck in the 2010s. I don't know if they still are, and I'm kinda hoping they aren't, but I mean, it's not my label, so I guess who am I to make that call? And I guess I can just shoehorn the current decade into the very end of this section since there isn't nearly as much ground to cover, with the most notable new releases being NOFX's past two full-lengths, single album, and double album. The skate punk band Cigar from Eugene, Oregon would also join the Fat roster in the early 2020s, releasing their full-length The Visitor in 2022. The New York-based Make War is also definitely worth a mention here too, and although they would technically join the label at the end of the previous decade with their first Fat release coming out in 2019, I think it's a little more appropriate to consider them part of the newer roster, as they actually seem to be getting a lot more buzz these days, even scoring themselves a slot on a Wilhelm Scream's 2022 tour. And finally, to round everything off, I also of course have to mention the new Subsidy Bottles to the Ground Records, which so far has primarily put out releases from NOFX side projects like The Melvinator and The Co-Defendants, but they've also recently added the UK band The Meths to their roster as well. And with that, I think we're officially up to the current day in Fat Wreck history, so now I think it's a good time to shine some light on their legacy and the impact they've had on punk rock over the years. So I think it's pretty safe to say that Fat Wreck has helped some of the biggest punk bands of the past 3 decades rise to the point they're at now. If it's not NOFX, then it's Rise Against, or Lagwagon, Against Me, Propagandhi, or even Anti-Flag. These are not bands you're gonna see at a local dive bar these days, and I have to say, I think there's something to be said about Mike having such a good eye for the right bands. I maybe wouldn't say every Fat Wreck release has been a total hit, but I'd certainly say they have a better track record than most indie labels of their stature. And I'd also say that's part of the reason why they were able to get so much bigger than some of their peers. And on top of that, Fat Wreck has stayed 100% dedicated to punk rock and still retained an extremely high degree of relevance through shifting trends in the genre. And they might even be the most widely known label that's strictly featured punk for over 30 years now. Of course, a label like Epitaph is definitely bigger, but keep in mind they branched off into other genres, which obviously made it easier for them to take off a little faster by appealing to more than one fan base. But Fat Wreck decided to stick to their guns instead, and I think that might have actually ensured them even more longevity in the punk scene than Epitaph, even if it's simply because they made such a name for themselves as the go-to label for punk bands and fans for the past 30 some odd years. And I think it's also important to mention that they're managing to survive at a reasonably steady pace during an era where record labels aren't doing well at all. Of course, they aren't as big as they used to be, but that's only natural in the digital age. But it's no secret that they have a certain amount of respect and dedication from their genre's audience that other labels, and especially majors, usually don't. Fat Records is a label made for musicians by musicians, and they've retained this really down-to-earth grassroots reputation that is truthfully pretty rare for all record labels, even bigger indies like them. I can honestly only think of a handful off the top of my head. Plus, even as we get further and further away from the age of record labels, Fat Wreck will always have a place in punk rock just because of how many impactful bands they put out. There's at least 50 punk rock classics with the Fat stamp on them, and a piece of music history like that is never gonna go away. Fat Wreck is another staple label that helped define a genre like earache, sub pop, or even Motown, and that's the kind of legacy that sticks to music no matter how much it changes. And as always, I'll be leaving you all with some of my personal thoughts on Fat Wreck and the impact they've had on me. So I'm sure it's no secret to any of you returning viewers that NOFX and the Fat Wreck bands have had a huge impact on me and my musical path. I got into NOFX when I was like 13, and honestly, they reinvented my whole outlook on music. I know I've said it before on the channel, but I'll say it again. Once I heard NOFX, it was straight down the rabbit hole of skate punk and its close cousins after that. And a good 6 out of 10 of my my all-time faves have at least done one record with Fat. I know I've also talked about Strung Out and Swing and Utters both being favorites of mine, and I think the only band I'd say I like more than those two is probably Suicidal Tendencies, but I could go on for hours talking about all the bands I love that have been associated with Fat in one way or another, so I think I'll just leave things there. That being said, I really do want to talk about the ethics of Fat Wreck and how that's also really struck a chord with me too, and I don't think I'm the only fan who would say this. Even when talking about indie labels, you'll still hear a lot of stories about bands or employees getting dicked around by the higher-ups, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone say anything bad about Fat Wreck in this regard. Obviously, I don't know Fat Mike or any of his friends and associates personally, but the fact that him and his label's integrity has pretty much been echoed throughout all corners of the scene since its inception, I think is another reason why it struck a chord with so many people, myself included. But that's enough for me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What are your favorite Fat Wreck bands? When did and how did you become a fan of the label in the first place? Would you want to see more content on record labels? If so, which ones? Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.